And welcome back, everybody. Hands on Apologetics. Got another book out. We just had Revolt Against Reality, which still is a very strong seller. It's put out by Catholic Answers Press. This book is on a slightly different subject, although in some ways related. This is put out by Emmaus Road Publishing. It's called The Gospel Truth: How You Can Know What Christ Taught. And you can pick it up. By the way, it's available at stpaulcenter.com. And last week I mentioned that, and I said it's available on Amazon. Actually, the Kindle version is available. You can pre-order it on Amazon. And the reason for that is the way Amazon works is you have to physically ship out your books to various places. And until it's at every place, they don't go live. So basically it's en route. So you can pre-order. You'll probably get it pretty quick. And it's my first hardcover book. So that's kind of cool. Lots of firsts with this book. It's also the first book where I center on, I think, a very, very important question. Namely, how do we know what Jesus actually did and taught? A lot of people think that the Gospels are little more than legends that were circulated throughout antiquity about this person named Jesus. You have the mythicists out there who think that Christianity basically took a whole bunch of myths and squished them together into a story about Jesus. So, it's an entire fabrication designed to make it sell for pagans. You have all sorts of different stories. Then, of course, you have the liberal Protestant scholars where they deny the historicity of the text and basically say that almost nothing Jesus said is actual ipsissum verba of Christ and so on and so forth. So it's being attacked on all different areas. And by the way, since Passion Week's coming up, if it hasn't already started, and I imagine it is, I haven't really been out to a store or something, but I imagine you'll see in magazines hit pieces on the Gospels, questioning the resurrection, historicity of Christ. That's all part of standard fare. It's been going on for years. And it's a shame, that they do that. And they'll quote so-called scholars who'll dismiss the Gospel's truth and so on and so forth. Well, how do you know it's true? This is an important question for all Christians. Because if we don't have reliable information about Jesus, then what are we doing, right? What's the point of Christianity? Because Christianity is kind of unique in that it's making some very important claims about a real historic person who lived in the first century, Jesus of Nazareth, who performed miracles, claimed to be the Son of God and the Messiah, proved them by his miracles, especially the resurrection, and founded a church. And all of that is based on rock-solid claims that there really is a historic person named Jesus. And so we need to know whether or not we can trust the most ancient records we have on hand, written by followers and companions of the followers. So it's attacked from all different angles. And by the way, our separated brethren, when it comes to defending the Gospels, are in many ways light years ahead of Catholic apologists. Just not only in terms of quality, but also quantity, especially. And they do a fantastic job defending the Gospels. However, that being said, I feel that they are the defenses they give can be a lot stronger than what they have. And when it comes to them going toe-to-toe with atheists, quite frankly, they win, but not by very much. They get beaten up pretty bad by atheists because of one big problem, and the problem is their Protestantism. I'll be frank with you guys. We're all friends here. They don't want to admit that there is a historic church with a memory that persists throughout time, and they want to vindicate the text alone, apart from the early church, at least as much as possible apart from the early church. And And you can't do that. At least you can maybe go a long way in terms of establishing the integrity of the Gospels. Namely, how do we know that the Bibles that we have in our hands, the Gospels, that the text itself is identical to the original? Well, you can do that through studying manuscripts and stuff, and they're very good with that. You can also open the possibility of, the authenticity of these works. They were written very close to the events that they record, and we have many copies. In fact, usually they'll do a comparison between the Gospels and pagan literature, for example. The pagan literature, the copies that we have, say, of the writings of Aristotle are almost 1,000 years after the time of Aristotle, and it's only in a few manuscripts. Yeah, you don't find a lot of people doubting whether or not the manuscripts that we do have from Aristotle are essentially accurate, right? But when it comes to the Gospels, you have the earliest manuscripts we have come very close to the time of Christ. And you can throw on top of that the early church fathers. They quote the Gospels, and some of them lived, right during the time the New Testament was being completed. You have abundant evidence to establish that. But there's one area that I think they're the weakest on. And evangelical scholarship, they try very hard, but it's hard to establish the truthfulness of the gospel or the veracity of the gospel if you don't appeal to the original community in which the Gospels were written. And that's a very important point because, okay, fine, even if you concede all the other points that these Gospels were written by the people they claim to be, that the text we have is identical to the original, but if you can't establish that they're telling the truth, then what good is it, right? And so you need the early church to not only verify what is said as being true, but vindicate, the Gospels. And see, that's the problem is evangelical scholarship's kind of between a rock and a hard place. On one hand, they need the early church in order to vindicate the Gospels so that they can have their Bibles and practice sola scriptura. On the other hand, they can't give the early church full credit because that comes perilously close to what's called sacred tradition, which sola scriptura denies. And I have to say, and this is a good sign that modern evangelical scholarship, especially very high academic scholarship, is pushing the edges on that. And you're seeing appeals being made to the early church to kind of vindicate the truthfulness of the Gospels. You're seeing that more and more, and it's getting later and later. Early church fathers are being invoked. But there's always that red line, that although we're citing these particular guys, that doesn't mean that the early church is reliable on other things, like doctrine, So that's why I wrote this book, because ultimately that incoherence, right, between trying to establish the truth of the Gospels and denying the reliability of the early church, we don't have a problem like that in Catholicism. We have a perfectly coherent apology for the Gospels. And if you follow the logic all the way through, with some important qualifications that need to be made, you not only get the truthfulness of the Gospels, the integrity of the Gospels, but you also get the canon, and you get the proper interpretation of the Gospels. This is another thing that Protestants punt on, and I've heard lots of Protestant, very prestigious Protestant apologists punt on this issue. Is how do even if the text is true and all that, everybody has different interpretations of what the text means. So essentially, an atheist would say, what difference does all this mean? Because even if they're truthful accounts and the veracity and integrity is established, it's just like everybody, it's a Rorschach test, ink blotches. Everybody makes out their own meaning as to what it is. So what good is it? Why not just follow your own religious instincts or something like that? And again, in the Catholic, if you use the Catholic paradigm, that doesn't become a problem. In fact, it's part of that coherent defense. So that's why I decided to tackle this. And I'm hoping that it'll be attractive to non-Catholics who want a robust defense of the Gospels. And also, as they're seeing this case being made, start hopefully opening their eyes to the historic church and ultimately the Catholic Church. Although honestly, I don't actually go as far as to conclude, therefore, the Catholic Church is right or you need to be Catholic. But the methodology, I think, opens the possibility of that. And so it's also a defense of the church, although it's not very explicit. So, so that's what the book's about. That's how it came, the generation about. I wanted to put this out. And so far, folks, over the last week, a lot of anecdotal evidence that I think it's working, because a lot of non-Catholics are saying, hey, this is awesome. We need a book like this. I'm picking up a copy. So if you're looking for an Easter gift for a non-Catholic or somebody that's asking you questions about Catholicism, this would be a great book, because it's defending something that we all defend. And actually, I'll give them great ammo to defend the Gospels. And it also will explain a lot about Catholic worldview as well. So I think it's on target. I think it's timely. And unfortunately, the timing got mixed up, and it's already printed in the warehouse, and the sensei was busy elsewhere. But I think when you're talking to non-believers today, so many people don't know Jesus. They never heard of Jesus outside of his name being used as a swear word. Unfortunately, the culture has gotten to the point where it's truly a post-Christian culture. And so Jesus kind of gets lost in the mix. So I think the first thing you need to do when you're talking to non-believers is you need to pique their interest, that there's something about this Jesus that deserves further investigation. I think that's your first goal, because if you don't do that, everything you'll say really won't make a difference, because they'll just brush it off as just part of other legends and folklore and myths and so on and so forth. But there should be something odd about this particular individual. Now, the difficulty, of course, is that they're non-believers. And so you can't appeal to the Gospels, not at least as inspired documents, maybe as historical documents, but still, it's you can't presume the truthfulness of the Gospels outright. So that's kind of not a common authority that you can use. So what can you use to demonstrate there's something unusual about this Jesus of Nazareth that deserves attention? Well, I like to appeal to two things that I think is pretty much incontrovertible. And the first one is just something they can verify through experience. And that is a very simple thing that just so happens to be one of the longest running miracles ever. And it's a miracle that is visible to all people. And it's a miracle that is, missed by all people, or virtually all people. And that is the miracle of the church. The church persisting throughout time for over 2,000 years, spreading across the globe, is still here intact, functioning, and it is rippling with vitality. Okay? Everybody can verify that. All you need to do is just look it up in the Catholic Church and directories. You'll find Catholic churches all over your area. You'll find them all over the area in every country, pretty much under the sun, around the world. It's here. So you have these communities that all trace themselves back to Jesus Christ over 2,000 years. When you compare it to all the other realms throughout history, it's unprecedented. The empires that have come and gone, lineages have run their course and disappeared. but the followers of Christ, the church, has persisted throughout time, throughout all these ages. It's really remarkable if you think about it. And even though the church is not in the greatest shape possible, and by the way, it never is in any age, but nevertheless, it still is vital. It still is important. And if you don't believe that, look at all the anti-Catholic stuff out there. If we were irrelevant and dormant, no one would pay attention to us. No one would care. But, the church is attacked constantly. So that is, I think, a proof that we're still relevant, right? Even though we've been around for 2,000 years and we're all over the world. I think that's a reason to say, there's something weird about that, okay? Even for a non-believer. That's the first thing I do. I appeal to this ongoing miracle. And by the way, that's a line of apologetics that I think somebody really needs to develop and show just how strange it is, The other thing comes from the culture in which Christianity was born. And this, I think, is also solid, maybe not as empirically solid as, the church still exists, but it's based on numerous sources, all of them non-biblical sources, all of them non-Christian sources. But we look at the historical backdrop in which Jesus of Nazareth comes on the scene, you find something very strange that's going on. Okay. And this is something I think even a lot of Catholics aren't aware of. A lot of Christians aren't either. The history behind, or the backdrop, historical backdrop to Jesus of Nazareth. Let me explain. If you go in our Wayback Machine, I'll do a little throwback to, was it Sherman and Peabody, or was it Peabody and his boy Sherman? Is that it? Go in our Wayback Machines, couple of thousand years back to the 1st century. You find something strange is happening in the Holy Land that is causing a lot of consternation. Okay. We find that the inhabitants of Judea have this expectation that this leader is going to come up and he's going to rule the entire world. And and it has to do with this Old Testament prophecy. Now, I'm not going to quote the Old Testament. I'm not even going to tell you what the prophecy is. I'm going to quote from historic sources, okay? The first one is a Jewish historian, Flavius Josephus, who lived from around 37 AD, died sometime around 100 AD. Flavius Josephus is a historian, so we have several of his histories. One of his claims to fame is that he was present at the first Jewish revolt. The Zealots staged a revolt against Rome. Remember, during the time of Jesus, they're under Roman occupation, and the Zealots decide, we're going to rebel against Rome, which is something unthinkable, actually, if you think about it, because Rome is like a world power. It is the world power. There is no other world power that can stand up to the Roman Empire. And the Zealots are just a bunch of guys, kind of like a local militia. The idea that this local militia will be able to win its own independence and freedom from the Roman Empire is stupid. I can't think of a better word. It is, the nth degree of ridiculousness, right? There's no way. The Zealots are ants, and the Roman Empire is a giant foot. Yet they waged this revolt against Rome. Now, I'm kind of getting ahead of the story, but what in the world would inspire the people of Judea to go against Rome, right? To go against this world power? And we have sources that tell us what the inspiration of this was. So here's Flavius Josephus. And this is on his Jewish War, Book 6, Chapter 5, Section 4, in which he talks about what was stirring the people at this time to actually start thinking about revolting against Rome? He says, quote, an ambiguous oracle that was also found in their sacred writings, which prophesied how, quote, about this time, one of their country would become governor of the inhabitable earth, unquote. The Jews took this prediction to belonging to themselves in particular, and many of the wise men were therefore deceived in their determination, unquote. So Josephus, who was actually there on the scene, tells us that this, all these problems and ultimately this armed revolt against Rome takes place. Why? Because of a certain oracle in the sacred writings of the Jews. He doesn't tell us what the oracles are. There is a quote, but I don't think it's actually from the text. But he's telling us essentially what the text says, namely that one of their countrymen will become the governor of the inhabitable earth, worldwide dominion. And he's going to come from Judea, and he's going to come in the first century. So you can see where the Jews who are under the occupation of Rome would look at this oracle and they would get excited, because not only are they going to get rid of Roman shackles, but they're going to be in charge of the world, okay, according to this oracle. And Josephus says that they misinterpreted it. They thought it was a prediction about a particular Jewish person who will become the ruler, namely the Messiah. But he will say they're wrong. Actually, it has to do with the Roman governors that squash the first revolt. Okay, so that's one text, right? There's this oracle. We also have a couple other ones too. There's also the Roman, two pagan sources, the Roman historian Tacitus, who lived from 56 to 120, and Suetonius. Suetonius lived from 69 to 130 AD. And they also speak of this. They talk about an old and established belief that had spread over the whole East, the Orient, that there would be a leader that would rise from Judea, and he would be basically the leader of the world, the ruler of the world. And they, too, thought that this prophecy was about Titus or Vespasian, the emperors that were involved in the destruction of the first revolt. But there's a problem, namely history. And when you look at history, it doesn't seem to pan out, right? Why? Because Vespasian and Titus were not the rulers of the whole inhabitable earth. In fact, most people today never even heard of Vespasian or Titus. And the Roman Empire that they were leaders for a time no longer exist. In fact, a lot of people today might not have even heard of the Roman Empire. Who knows? So who's this mysterious figure that caused all this consternation through this oracle? Is it a false prophecy? Is it a real prophecy? But you need to set the table for them, right? Because you need to give them the motivation to say there's something strange about this Jesus of Nazareth. And to do that, like I said at the beginning of the program, is first, you appeal to something they can't deny. Actually, two things. One is, I think, apparent, namely the church exists today. There are Christians around the globe, all claiming to be historically linked to Jesus. The Catholic Church can trace its way back 2,000 years. That, I think, is pretty undeniable. And the second is what we talked about in the last segment, namely, if you look at extra biblical evidence, so we're not appealing to the Bible, we're just looking at historic figures and records and histories. And non-Christian at that. We have the Jewish historian Josephus, and we have two pagan historians, Tacitus and Suetonius. And they talk about this mysterious oracle that everybody has heard about that comes from the East, that there's going to be this ruler that's going to rise in the first century, and he's going to become the governor of the inhabitable earth. He's going to rule everywhere that there's people. And that's kind of where we left it. But there's a lot more to the story because, as you can imagine, if you have an oracle like that and people are starting to get excited about the impending advent of this king, you're going to have people who will think that the prophecy is about them, right? And that's precisely what you find, especially in Josephus. He actually chronicles, I think, about a half dozen, almost a dozen people in the first century claimed to be someone important who got a whole bunch of followers behind them. And the Romans came, they executed them, and the followers dispersed. And it's like a broken record over and over again, the same thing. Somebody claims to be, I am this Messiah person. People follow him. He gets executed. Everybody leaves. Why? Well, for the simple reason that you don't follow a dead person, right? If you want a leader who's going to be the governor of the inhabitable earth, he needs to be alive, right? That makes perfect sense. So I guess this guy's not the Messiah. Well, then you come to Jesus of Nazareth. And Josephus, actually the Jewish historian Josephus, records a little bit about Jesus. He says some very good things about him, and he mentions he's a miracle worker and that he had a group of followers. And he also mentions that he was executed. And, and he says, and I think people misread Josephus because I think this last line of this testimony of Jesus he has should be read with surprise because he says, and his followers are still around. Now, he's writing about 100 AD. Jesus was executed probably AD 33, maybe, AD 30, somewhere around there, probably AD 30. And they didn't disperse like all the false messiahs that he chronicles. So he cites it as being kind of odd. And I think that is remarkable in and of itself. In fact, depending on whether or not you think the passage is entirely genuine, he says that they claim or that he appeared alive to the apostles or to his followers, I should say. Which even if you don't think that's part of the authentic testimony, that's fine. But, it kind of connects, they believe something about Jesus that even though apparently he was executed, he's still possibly the governor of the inhabitable earth, right? This Messiah figure. Something caused that. And, this idea of resurrection would explain a lot, right? Because he's not dead. They're not following a dead person. They're following a live person. But we're kind of getting beyond this. So the evidence is that this Jesus of Nazareth is executed, but his followers don't disperse. Now, let's change from this Jewish historian writing about 100 AD to Roman historian, namely Tacitus, one of the greatest ancient scholars, ancient historians out there, who's very particular about getting things right. And Tacitus has to mention, he's covering the fire in Rome. There was this large fire, and people blamed Nero, and Nero blamed the Christians. So Tacitus is kind of forced to explain who Christians are for his readers, because the pagan readers that are reading his history may not know who this group is. So he has to fill in the blank. And he says that they're named after a person named Chrestus. And this Chrestus was executed by Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius Caesar. So here we have an extra biblical source. This is a pagan historian affirming things that we recite in the Creed, namely that Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate, and that this took place during the reign of Tiberius. But he also says something else. He says, after mentioning the execution, he says, and this strange sect spread like a contagious disease throughout the empire. It's like the original COVID. So not only do the followers of this leader not disperse and become a footnote in history or just plain out forgotten, but it grows, it explodes throughout the ancient world. He likens it to a contagious disease, right? So it's like Christian COVID, I guess. And he's kind of alarmed a little bit by that. And it even reaches Rome. And that's where he starts talking about Nero and the fire and Christians. Again, so counterintuitive. Why is it that all these other people who claim to be spoken of in this ancient oracle, they get a following, they get executed, the following disappears, except for Jesus, right? It surprised Josephus. It surprised Tacitus. Doesn't make any sense how these followers are following a dead man. Well, of course, the Christians have the answer to that, right? He's not dead. He's risen from the dead. But nevertheless, so we have lots of extra-biblical, non-Christian sources that affirm this, right? That there was a leader in the first century who was executed, and his followers continue. So that's the one end of the bookend. And then today, like we said, the church is here, all over the world, all following Christ, and Catholics can trace their history back all the way to Christ. So was this a false oracle? Well, it certainly didn't apply to those leaders that were executed and their followers dispersed, because obviously they never became the governor of the known world. It certainly doesn't even apply to the emperors, like Tacitus and Suetonius claimed. Vespasian and Titus, they became emperors. They were rulers over part of the world, but they died. And now kids are forced to learn about them in ancient history. And their footnotes in books, they have no impact today, right? Even the Roman Empire, as strong and as long as it dominated the West, has disappeared. Now you can go sightseeing and see the ruins of the former buildings. It's, again, a footnote in history. But not this Jesus of Nazareth. His followers are still here, still robust, and like I said, still relevant. Not only that, but Christianity sparks. Its teachings spark a revolution, not just of numbers, but of thought. And I cover this in depth in my Revolt Against Reality, if you guys ever want to see that. Or Michael Aquilina actually has some really great books where he teases out the details. These intellectual revolutions of thought that come from the Christian genesis of the incarnation. Modern science is a product, ultimately, of Christian revelation, of the Christian West, of the church, actually. International law, the university system. That's just a couple of things that spawned from Christian thought, Christian revelation about Jesus of Nazareth. So that leaves us with the question, who is this Jesus of Nazareth, right? If there's ever a person in history that needs to be studied, it would be he, right? It would be him. Is it he or him? I don't know, Richard, you can tell me the correct grammatical thing. But anyway, just given those facts, and I think those facts are pretty much incontrovertible. You know, the church exists today. There was this history. We know it from extra-biblical, non-Christian sources. And it came during a time, through most of the church history under persecution. The church is still being persecuted today. And yet, it's still here. It's still vibrant. It's still around the world. And it spawned all these things that revolutionized the West. So, when you do that, I think you intrigue a person into saying, okay, he's important. Now the question is, how do you know what he said and did? How do you know that it's not just made up and there was this myth that surrounded this individual? Well, you gotta wait for another program or buy my book. The Gospel Truth, How We Can Know What Jesus taught and did. It's available through stpaulcenter.com, or you can pre-order it on Amazon. All right, guys. Hey, thank you so much for allowing me to bend your ear. Hopefully you found this interesting. I did.